Thank you for tuning in. Today we're going to be looking at my camera rig for my GH5S. So I do commercial film and documentary film, and I think it's important here to mention that this camera rig was specifically designed for run and gun documentary work. So first off, why buy the GH5S? Build it into this big rig when you can buy cameras like the FX6 or the FX9 from Sony or the Canon C300 Mark III that already have an ergonomic design to them and you don't have to build them up at all. So 3 years ago, those cameras weren't available. When the GH5S came out, the only other cameras that I was interested in that were available were the Sony FS7 and the C300 Mark II. And at that time, the FS7 and the C300 Mark II were around $10,000 with tax and all the accessories and batteries and cards and stuff like that. So it was just out of my price range. Also, the FS7 didn't have timecode in and out. You had to buy this external mount for the back to get timecode in and out, which made the camera really big. And the C300, even though it shot 4K 24 frames per second, it wasn't shooting 60 frames per second slow motion, and I just thought that was unacceptable. Those two things are things I really wanted in a camera, and I didn't want to pay $10,000 for a camera that didn't have those items. But when the GH5S came out, it was only $2,500 Canadian, and it checked off most of the boxes that I wanted except for two things. It didn't have built-in ND filters, and it wasn't ergonomic. But it had 4K up to 60 frames per second, 4K 10-bit internal recording, 1080p up to 240 frames per second slow motion, dual native ISO, so it had the ability to shoot in lower light. Panasonic also offered a 2-channel XLR audio adapter that linked in through the hot shoe on top of the GH5S, and it offered timecode in and out through the flash port. So for me, for the price of the camera and what it had to offer, outweighed the things that I couldn't get, like the built-in ND filters and the ergonomic design. So I bought two GH5Ss for around $6,000 at that time. My plan was to have one of the GH5S cameras as an A camera and build it up into a more ergonomically designed camera unit so I could do handheld stuff and run and gun documentary stuff. And the B camera was supposed to stay small so it could fit onto gimbals and get into tight situations. I think it's important here to mention that I have used these GH5S cameras for the past 3 years on professional broadcast documentary shoots, and they've held up incredibly well. So now we're going to break down the A camera and the B camera rigs and why I built it the way I built it, what went into building it, and how much did it cost to do that. So let's dive into the B camera first since it's the most simple. So we have the GH5S body with the Metabones Speedbooster Canon Ef to micro four thirds T Smart adapter for $811.10 Canadian. So the equivalent for a 24mm full frame lens on a micro four thirds sensor with the Speed Booster is a 34mm full frame equivalent. Plus I gain an extra stop of light, so it makes my f4 lenses f2.8. For the cage, I use the SmallRig Panasonic Lumix GH5S cage, $65.90 Canadian. Attached to that cage is the SmallRig Mini Quick Release NATO rail, $16.22 Canadian, for a monitor or handle. My monitor is a small HD focus 5-inch, $599.99 Canadian, and the cage for the monitor is the SmallRig monitor cage with sun hood for small HD focus 5-inch monitor, $86.11 Canadian. I use the SmallRig swivel and tilt monitor mount with NATO clamp, $73.64 Canadian, to attach to the camera cage's NATO rail. I also came up with a really cool option for the time code in and out with the GH5S cable that comes out of the flash port. Using the timecode cable that runs out of the flash port of the GH5S, I secured it with a metal wire to the camera cage and then to a SmallRig HDMI cable clamp, $29.95 Canadian, for the BNC connection of the timecode cable. I have the BNC cable pointing directly up for easy access when working with sound guys. Having the BNC cable pointing up for sound guys makes it really easy for them to connect and see where the timecode in and out cable is. I secured the cable with some metal wiring to the camera cage. So now I have this nice little small setup for my B camera. The final weight of the B camera is 2.5 pounds. The final cost of this camera is $4,081 Canadian before any taxes, and this is not including lenses. Alright, let's take a look at the A camera setup. Remember, I never have to tear down this A camera rig because I have my B camera rig always on standby if I need to fit into tighter situations or mounted to a gimbal. So we have the GH5S body, $23.99 Canadian, with the Metabones SpeedBooster Ef micro four thirds T Speed Booster XL 0.64, $811.10 Canadian, and I gain a little extra stop of light because it's a 0.64 speed booster. So it turns my Canon f4 lenses into f2.5. So with the Metabones Speed Booster on the micro four thirds sensor, it makes my Canon 24mm full frame lenses, roughly a 30mm full frame equivalent. We have the SmallRig cage with XLR helmet kit for $210.87 Canadian. I modified this. I took the handle off and flipped the sliding piece of metal upside down and chopped off the handle attachment portion. So I gained some space and I lost some weight by doing this. I used this part to hold my monitor and my onboard mic. The monitor is connected with a SmallRig aluminum alloy 15mm rod, $12.48 Canadian. Then the rod to the SmallRig 15mm rod clamp with cold shoe mount, $19.84 Canadian. Then from the clamp to a SmallRig mini quick release NATO rail, $16.22 Canadian. From the rail to the SmallRig swivel and tilt monitor mount with the NATO clamp, $73.62 Canadian, which is attached to the SmallRig monitor cage with sun hood for small HD focus 5-inch series, $86.12 Canadian. Farther down the rod, I attached my Rode NTG2 shotgun mic, which is connected to the SmallRig 15mm rod clamp with cold shoe mount, $19.84 Canadian. Then from the clamp to a universal shock mount, $36.13 Canadian, which holds the Rode NTG2 mic, $335.74 Canadian, which connects to a very short XLR cable, $15 Canadian. This XLR cable connects to the Panasonic Professional Microphone Adaptor 2 XLR terminal, $499 Canadian. I love this audio adapter. It's got phantom power, 2 standard XLR connections, low cut options, gain options, automatic level control, lock connection to the top of the GH5 hot shoe that's very firm, plus the SmallRig helmet cage tightens that connection and protects it as well. Now that we're at the top of the camera, let's take a look at the handle. I have the SmallRig NATO top handle with record start and stop trigger for Panasonic cameras, $98.59 Canadian, so I can start and stop recording without having to take my hand off the handle. Also, I ran a cable from the handle through the SmallRig cage so it's not in the way, and used metal wire to secure the cable in place so it never comes loose. Let's head to the back of the camera where I set up the V-mount connection. So I did something different here with mounting the V-mount connection. I have the SmallRig cheese plate, $35.82 Canadian, but I hacked off about 1.5 inches of it to lose some of the weight and gain some space. I took my satchel plate from my Ace tripod and cut 1.5 inches off of it for weight, and because it was getting in the way, the lens focus and zoom ring. I also drilled holes on the back end of the plate to connect to my cheese plate. This is great because then you don't have to use any rails or rail plates, so you save space and weight on the camera rig. To get the power from the V-mount battery, I used the DMW DCC12 DC dummy battery with D-tap, $53.99 Canadian, and I put the XS cable in between the camera and the cheese plate. So the last thing I added was a SmallRig right side wooden handle grip for $122.30 Canadian. So this wooden handle is connected to the camera cage with a SmallRig low profile native rail, $19.96 Canadian, which I ended up bending with my vise and some vice grips so the handle wouldn't stick out so far. Another great thing about having the wooden handle away from the cage is you now have 2 contact points to choose from when operating. I can use the wooden handle for better stabilized footage when doing handheld work, or I can use the native GH5S handle with all my function buttons for easy access. The timecode setup is the same as the B camera with the SmallRig HDMI cable clamp, $29.95 Canadian, with metal cable wire holding the BNC cable to the camera cage. Finally, I have the Polar Pro Basecamp 3-stage matte box, $1,434.81 Canadian, so I can have the variable ND and other filter options. The final weight of the A camera is 11.5 pounds. It's right on that heavy side where you're not going to get those jitters when you're doing handheld work. The cost of this camera and rig together is $6,329.38 Canadian before any taxes, not including the lenses. So if you're interested in building your rig up the way I have my GH5S, all of these items will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.